And singer John Oates from the legendary rock duo Hall and Oates is opening up about his legal dispute with former bandmate Daryl Hall. Hall made headlines last year when he sued Oates over their music catalog. Now, Oates says the feud might jeopardize their future.
Imagine spending 50 years building something with another person. 50 years of sold-out arenas, chart-topping records, and a sound the whole world knew by heart. And then one morning, with no phone call and no warning, that same person quietly tries to sell the very thing you built together to a stranger. That is exactly what Daryl Hall says happened to him. For decades, the world saw the perfect duo. Behind it, something was rotting. And at 79, Daryl Hall has finally said the words out loud in a courtroom under oath. The secret deal. To understand why Daryl Hall reacted so strongly, you first have to understand what was at stake. At the center of the dispute was a company called Hall Oates Enterprises, the business entity that controlled much of the Hall and Oates legacy. This company held the trademarks, the Hall and Oates name and likeness, royalty streams, and important digital assets, including websites and social media accounts. In many ways, it represented the foundation of everything the duo had built over more than 50 years. Hall and Oates each owned an equal 50% stake. By the fall of 2023, tensions between the longtime partners had already reached a breaking point. The two sides were engaged in mediation, attempting to resolve increasingly complex business disagreements. But while those discussions were taking place, a significant development occurred behind Hall's back. According to court filings, on October 2, 2023, John Oates' representatives signed a confidential non-disclosure agreement with Primary Wave Music, one of the world's largest music rights investment companies. Known for acquiring valuable catalogs, trademarks, and artist brands, Primary Wave approaches music assets as long-term business investments rather than personal legacies. Hall later claimed he knew nothing about these discussions. It was only around October 20th that he received formal notice that Oates intended to sell his 50% stake in Hall Oates Enterprises to Primary Wave. The timing made the news even more shocking. Hall said the notice arrived just days before he was scheduled to leave for an international tour that included stops across the West Coast, Japan, and the Philippines. For Hall, the issue was not simply that Oates wanted to sell. It was the manner in which it happened. After decades of partnership, he felt there had been no meaningful conversation about a decision that could permanently reshape the future of the business they had built together. Instead, he was suddenly faced with the possibility of becoming partners with a major corporate investment firm. What made the situation even more troubling for Hall was that Primary Wave was not an unknown company. The firm already owned interests in portions of the Hall and Oates catalog dating back years. Hall understood exactly how the company operated and what such a partnership could mean. To him, the dispute was never primarily about money. It was about control of a brand and legacy that carried his own name. Feeling he had no other option, Daryl Hall took the fight to court. The ultimate betrayal. On November 16th of 2023, Daryl Hall filed suit in a Nashville Chancery Court, moving to block the sale. Days earlier, he had also opened a private arbitration case against Oates, Oates' wife, and the co-trustee of Oates' trust. The court moved quickly and granted a temporary restraining order, freezing the deal in place while the dispute played out. The judge even set a bond, a sum of money meant to compensate Oates in case it later turned out he had been wrongly restrained from doing something he had every right to do. In other words, the court took the freeze seriously, but kept the door open to the possibility that Oates was in the right. At the end of November, the judge held a hearing on whether to extend that freeze, and he sided with Hall for the moment. The chancellor reasoned that allowing the transfer to go forward before an arbitrator could properly weigh in might cause irreparable harm and could effectively render the entire arbitration pointless. So the sale stayed frozen. The fight would continue behind closed doors. And then came the filings that pulled the curtain all the way back. In his sworn declaration to the court, Daryl Hall did not hold back. He stated that while Oates had spent months claiming his trust wanted to maintain its ownership, Oates and the co-trustees had engaged in what Hall called the ultimate partnership betrayal. He said they had surreptitiously sought to sell half of the company's assets without his written approval. He said he was blindsided. He wrote that there was no amount of money that could compensate him for being forced into a partnership he never agreed to, and that the harm was unimaginable. He called the primary wave agreement a completely clandestine and bad faith move in blatant violation of their agreement. And then he wrote the line that cuts deepest of all. He said he was deeply troubled by the deterioration of his relationship with and his trust in John Oates. He said Oates's behavior had become adversarial and aggressive instead of professional and courteous. He even suggested that Oates's intent had become to burden and harass him, without regard for his interests as a business partner. This was a man who had spent 50 years carefully keeping the backstage drama away from the fans and the press. For decades, both men had insisted publicly that they got along, that they never really fought. The fact that Hall was now willing to put all of this into a court document with his name on it for the whole world to read tells you everything about how deep the wound went. But remember, there are always two truths in this story. And John Oates told his. Oates strikes back. John Oates did not stay silent. He filed his own declaration with the court, and his version of events looks nothing like Daryl Hall's. Oates said he was tremendously disappointed that Hall had chosen to make what he called inflammatory, outlandish, and inaccurate statements about him. He said he had no idea what was motivating Hall to take these steps, and that he was deeply hurt. He flatly denied the core accusation, stating that Hall's claims that he had breached their agreement, gone behind his back, and acted in bad faith were simply not true. He added, with a note of frustration, that his commitment to confidentiality prevented him from publicly discussing the truth, but that this was the agreement he had made. And Oates's lawyers made a legal argument that reframes the entire dispute. They contended that the sale was actually allowed under the terms of their business agreement, which appeared to give the partners certain rights when one of them wanted to sell to an outsider. In their telling, Oates had proceeded exactly as he was permitted to, and Hall could have done the very same thing himself. When Oates finally spoke publicly on Good Morning America in 2024, he was strikingly gentle compared to the fury in Hall's filings. He explained that the whole situation had gotten mired in complex legal wrangling and that it was honestly ruining his life and making him unhappy. So he decided he would simply step aside, the way people do all the time. The problem, he said, was that Hall did not like the idea of him selling to a particular buyer. Then Oates said something that responded directly to Hall's claim that he did not really know him. Oates suggested that Hall should have looked a little closer, and that Hall himself had changed a great deal over the years. And he offered a message to his old partner that stood in stark contrast to everything Hall had said. He said he loved Hall like a brother. He said brothers have disagreements, and families grow apart. He said he wished Hall the best, and even hoped Hall could pursue his dream of being a respected solo artist, something Oates believed Hall had always quietly wanted. In his other interviews, Oates was almost philosophical about the whole thing. Promoting his music, he said he had simply moved on, that he felt like he had a new lease on his creative life. He described being trapped in the legal wrangling as something that was genuinely making him miserable. He once compared his decades inside the Hall and Oates machine to walking through a museum, saying that near the end, your feet start to hurt and you just cannot wait to get out. He even read aloud a Taoist passage about walking a path alongside a companion for as long as you can, and when you must part, never holding that companion back. One man called it the ultimate betrayal. The other called it a family growing apart. So who is right? The honest answer is that we may never fully know because of how this all ended. The word everyone gets wrong. You have probably seen the headlines claiming that Daryl Hall hates John Oates. It makes for a dramatic thumbnail. But here is what is actually true. In all the interviews, all the court filings, all the public statements, Daryl Hall has never once said he hates John Oates. Not in those words. What he has said is something colder, more precise, and in some ways more devastating than hatred. He said he was betrayed. He used the phrase, the ultimate partnership betrayal. He said he was deeply troubled by the deterioration of his relationship with, and his trust in, John Oates. He said the harm was unimaginable. These are not the words of a man throwing a tantrum. They are the words of a man who feels something far heavier than anger. They are the words of a man grieving a relationship he thought he understood, and discovering, at the age of 77 when this all began, that he may not have understood it at all. So when people ask why Daryl Hall hates John Oates, they are asking the wrong question. The real question is this: what could one man possibly do to another, after 50 years side by side, to make him stand up in a court of law and call it the ultimate betrayal? To answer that, we have to go back to the very beginning, back to a night in Philadelphia in 1967, when a fight broke out and two strangers ran for the same elevator. The elevator in Philadelphia. In 1967, Daryl Hall and John Oates were both students at Temple University in Philadelphia. Hall was studying music. Oates was studying journalism. Each of them led his own band, and on one particular night, both of their groups were booked to play at a dance at a local ballroom. But the music never finished. A fight broke out between rival street gangs in the crowd. By some accounts, there were even gunshots. In the chaos, as everyone scrambled for the exits, Hall and Oates both bolted for the same service elevator and ended up crammed inside it together, two young musicians escaping the same danger. Hall, ever the talker, struck up a conversation. He realized they both went to Temple. They got to talking about music, about the bands they each fronted, about the soul records they both loved. And something clicked. Not a friendship exactly, not at first, but a recognition, a sense that these two very different people might have something to offer each other. They became roommates, and in a detail that tells you everything about how little they thought of the brand they would become, the name Hall and Oates was not some grand creative decision. It was simply how their mail was addressed. The landlord scrawled Hall and Oates on the mailbox, and the name stuck. Neither man even particularly liked it. To this day, Oates has pointed out that they always insisted on being seen as two individuals working together, not as a single entity with a hyphen between them. From those humble beginnings came one of the most commercially dominant partnerships in the history of popular music. They signed with Atlantic Records in 1972, guided early on by the legendary executive Ahmet Ertegun. Their first few albums built slowly, with the song She's Gone off their 1973 record eventually becoming a classic. But it was after they moved to RCA that everything exploded. And even in those early days, the seeds of the divide were already planted, because while the world would come to see them as a perfect pair, the two men inside that partnership always saw themselves as something else entirely. Two individuals, two separate artists, who simply happened to work together. The best-selling duo in history. Once the hits started, they did not stop. After signing with Atlantic Records in 1972 and later moving to RCA, Hall and Oates became an absolute machine. Consider the run they put together. 6 #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. Rich Girl, Kiss on My List, Private Eyes, I Can't Go For That, May Need Her, Out of Touch. Add to that a deep catalog of songs that have never left the radio. Sarah Smile, She's Gone, You Make My Dreams, One on One. In April of 1984, the Recording Industry Association of America officially named Hall and Oates the most successful duo in the history of rock and roll. And that title was not a fluke of one good decade. To this day, they remain the best-selling duo of all time. More than the Carpenters, more than the Everly Brothers, more than Simon and Garfunkel. Between 1974 and 1991, they landed 33 songs on the Hot 100, and 29 of them cracked the top 40. They played Live Aid in 1985 in front of the entire world. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014, with the ceremony introduced by Questlove of The Roots, who joked that their music could cure any known ailment. They got a star, on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. They had already been inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame years earlier. By every external measure, they were a triumph, an unbreakable institution of American music. Their sound was its own kind of invention. They fused Philadelphia soul with rock and pop in a way that had not quite been done before. A smooth, instantly recognizable blend that dominated radio, and later, the brand new world of MTV. When music videos arrived in the early 1980s, Hall and Oates were perfectly positioned for it, and songs like Maneater and Out of Touch became visual staples of the era. For a stretch in the early to mid-1980s, it was hard to turn on a radio anywhere in America without hearing them. But here is the thing about partnerships that look flawless from the outside. The cracks always begin somewhere no one can see. And to understand how this story ended in a courtroom, you have to understand a truth about Hall and Oates that most fans never fully grasped. It was never really an equal partnership. And that imbalance, more than anything else, is where the trouble began. Two men, two truths. Here is something that gets lost in the mythology of Hall and Oates. For most of their career, Daryl Hall was the dominant force, and it was not particularly close. Hall sang lead on virtually every one of their hits. He wrote or co-wrote the bulk of their biggest songs. He was the voice, one of the greatest blue-eyed soul voices America ever produced. He was the face on the magazine covers, the one the interviewers wanted, the one the front rows were screaming for. Hall himself has described the dynamic in blunt terms. He compared it to Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, saying that even when they were a duo, they never really operated as one. He was the front man doing everything up at the front, while Oates was back there. He has been even more pointed than that. Years before the lawsuit, on a podcast, Hall pushed back hard when someone called Oates his partner. He said Oates was his business partner, not his creative partner. He said they were brothers in a business sense, but never creative brothers. He even pointed to a specific song, Kiss on My List, and noted that the harmonies people assumed were a duo effort were actually all him. Now, sit with that for a moment, and then look at it from John Oates' side, because there is a second truth here, and it is just as real. Imagine being John Oates. Imagine spending 50 years of your life inside a partnership where every interviewer asks about the other guy's voice, where every spotlight finds the other guy's face, where your own contributions, real and significant and documented, are perpetually treated as the background to someone else's genius. Oates has always maintained that he made his peace with it, that he and Hall were like brothers with a powerful musical bond. But comfort and resentment can live in the same house for a very long time. And here is the insight that most tellings of this story completely miss. When you really look at the timeline, Daryl Hall's anger may not actually be about the lawsuit at all. It may be about something much older and much sadder. Listen to how Hall describes their later years, and you start to hear it. He talks about feeling restricted, about the endless touring, about a partnership that had become a cage. He has said the real truth is that one day John simply said he did not want to do it anymore, and Hall said, fine. The split itself was not the wound. The wound was how it was handled. Think about what that means. For years, by Hall's own telling, he sensed his partner drifting away. He watched Oates pour energy into solo projects. He noticed Oates subtly reframing his own role in their success in interviews, emphasizing his own contributions in ways that, to Hall, felt like a quiet campaign to build a separate legacy. He felt the collaborative spark replaced by something professional and hollow. And Hall says he chose, for years, to let all of it go, because the legacy mattered more than the grievance, because the fans deserved the real thing, or at least the closest version of it that two estranged men could still deliver. He held on, hoping the partnership could still be salvaged, right up until the moment in late 2023 when he decided it could not. That is the deeper layer. The 2023 betrayal did not come out of nowhere. It was the final confirmation of a fear Daryl Hall had been carrying for over a decade. The fear that to his partner of 50 years, It had only ever been a business, but the easy creative spark from that elevator in 1967 had long since burned out. In fact, by both of their accounts, they had stopped really talking to each other at all. The strangers who made music together. This is the detail that makes the whole tragedy come into focus. By his own admission, John Oates has said that over the final 20 years of their partnership, he and Daryl Hall barely spoke. He described the routine plainly. They would show up to a concert separately. They would walk on stage. They would play the hits the crowd came to hear. And then they would walk off and go their separate ways. Two men living entirely separate lives, connected by nothing but a set list. Daryl Hall has confirmed the same thing from his side. He has said the last song he actually wrote with Oates was back in 2000, and even that was with another collaborator involved. For more than 2 decades, the creative relationship that built their empire simply did not exist anymore. They were not collaborators. They were two solo artists wearing a shared name like an old costume. Oates eventually moved away, building a life in Colorado and later Nashville, far from the orbit of his old partner. The two of them had become, in every meaningful sense, strangers. And yet, to the public, they were still Hall and Oates, still the perfect duo, still selling out shows on the strength of a chemistry that had died years before. There is something quietly heartbreaking about that. They had gotten so good at performing closeness, for the cameras, for the fans, for the entire mythology of what their name represented, that they forgot to actually maintain the real relationship underneath it. They became experts at being Hall and Oates in public, while privately becoming people who no longer knew each other at all. And here is the cruel logic of that situation. When strangers have a disagreement, they do not pick up the phone and talk it out. They do not lean on 50 years of trust, because that trust is gone. Instead, they call their lawyers, which is exactly what happened in November of 2023, when John Oates made a move that Daryl Hall says changed absolutely everything. A quiet ending. For all the fireworks of those dueling declarations, the resolution of this saga was strangely quiet. The dispute moved into confidential arbitration, away from the public eye, exactly as their agreement required. The terms were sealed. The details of who gave what, who kept what, and what Whole Oats Enterprises was even worth, none of it was ever made public. And then, in August of 2025, Daryl Hall's attorneys filed a status report noting that the matter had reached a final judgment in arbitration and moved to dismiss the court case. The whole storm ended, not with a dramatic verdict, but with a sealed envelope and a closed file. Anyone who tells you they know who won or how much money changed hands is guessing. That information remains locked away. What is not sealed is how the two men feel about ever sharing a stage again. And on that, they agree completely. There will be no reunion. Daryl Hall, asked in early 2025 whether there was any chance of repairing things, said that ship has gone to the bottom of the ocean. Asked by another outlet when he ever misses John Oates, he said there was no such time. There never was. He has said he has not spoken to Oates in a very long time, and that going solo, in his words, frees him. He even noted that his real creative partner for decades has been Dave Stewart of the Eurythmics, not Oates at all. Both men have moved on musically. Daryl Hall released a solo album called D in 2024 and has kept touring and making his long-running web series. He has played with Elvis Costello and with Glenn Tilbrook of Squeeze, and in 2025, he headlined his first ever solo show at London's Royal Albert Hall. John Oates put out an album called Reunion in 2024 and a self-titled record in 2025, returning to the soulful sound he loves, working with a new generation of collaborators. Each man, in his own way, has built a life on the far side of the partnership, and by most accounts, each has found that life lighter than the one they left behind. Hall has said that everyone tells him going solo is a happier experience. So at 79 years old, Daryl Hall is not a man consumed by hatred. He is something more complicated than that. He is a man carrying a grief that looks like anger. He gave his life to something extraordinary, and the person he built it with, the person he trusted with everything, treated it, in Hall's eyes, like a simple transaction on the way out the door. At 79, you do not have enough years left to pretend that does not hurt. And yet, there is one more truth worth holding on to, the version of events where John Oates is not a villain at all. In this version, Oates is a man who spent 50 years as the supporting act, who watched the spotlight find his partner again and again, who tried quietly and unsuccessfully to be seen as an equal, and who finally concluded that the only language the partnership would ever truly understand was action. Maybe selling his stake without a long emotional conversation was not contempt. Maybe it was simply the move of a man who had run out of other ways to be heard. We cannot know for certain. But it is worth remembering that the man Hall calls a betrayer is also a man who, even in the middle of the fight, said he still loved his partner like a brother. But here is what none of it can touch. Sarah, Smile. Maneater, I Can't Go For That. Rich Girl, Kiss on My List. You Make My Dreams. Those songs exist, and they always will. No court filing can reach back into 1972 and unwrite them. No arbitration ruling can pull them off the radio. No amount of silence between two old men can undo the fact that the music got made, and that it landed, and that it stuck. Two young men ran into the same elevator in 1967, fleeing the same fight, and walked out the beginning of something the whole world would fall in love with. They could not have known it then. They were just two college kids with different backgrounds and a shared love of soul music. But what they built in the years that followed outgrew both of them. It became part of the soundtrack of millions of lives, the songs playing at weddings and on first dates and on long drives home, woven so deeply into the culture that people who could not name a single member of the duo can still sing every word of the chorus. The lawsuit cannot erase that. The silence cannot erase that. The betrayal, real or imagined, depending on which man you believe, cannot erase that either. Somewhere out there, right now, in a passing car, in the corner of a quiet restaurant, in a pair of headphones on a crowded train, one of their songs is playing. And the person listening is not thinking about Whole Oats Enterprises or Primary Wave or a sealed arbitration file in Nashville. They are just feeling something, the way the song always made people feel. And maybe in the end, that is the thing that outlasts all the anger. Not the fight, not the fortune, not the 50 years of accumulated grievances that finally boiled over into a courtroom. Just the music, still doing exactly what it was always meant to do, long after the two men who made it stopped speaking. 50 years of music ended by a deal made in silence. Whatever else is true, Daryl Hall believed he deserved one phone call, and he says he never got it. If you liked this, hit like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos.